Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Nicolaisen, and I'm going to be talking about the inequality of equalities, the negotiation of the incommensurable ontologies of Han Buddhists and Dayan hunters in Taiwan. The central question of my presentation is, what is equality? So I'm going to start by looking at two forms of equality. The human equality, with which we're all very familiar, and I'm going to talk about that from the perspective of John Locke, as he's one of the early pioneers of this concept of human equality. And the other form of equality is the equality of life, which has a long history in Buddhist thought, but is presently advocated in Taiwan by the nun Shi and others as well. But I would say that one of the most prominent advocates is Shi, and I'll introduce her momentarily. So the way that I'm going to go about looking at what equality is through ontological analysis. And this ontological analysis has four goals. First, to put teachings such as Buddhism, Christianity, liberalism, and Dayan Gaga on equal terms. And in a moment, I'll introduce what Dayan Gaga is. And second, to challenge the applicability of the categories of nature and religion in Chinese teachings. Third, I want to demonstrate how the separation of church and state and the freedom of religion serve to suppress non-theistic teachings. And fourth, I'll consider alternatives to liberalism in the form of quality of life in particular. So first, I want to introduce briefly human equality as explained by John Locke through the work of Jeremy Waldron. Jeremy Waldron is a legal scholar and historian at Yale University. And he argues that in our current world, few people ask for justification for human equality. Basically, we take it for granted. At the time of John Locke, human equality was not taken for granted. In fact, it was a radical idea, and human inequality was the norm. In addition, Jeremy Waldron argues that Locke still makes the best case for the foundation of human equality. He also argues that Locke's argument is inseparable from Christianity. So let me just review what John Locke's argument basically is. Locke argues that God bestowed rationality to humans and only to humans so that humans can know him. And virtue arises from knowing there is a God who keeps you to account. Since you know that God will punish you for doing good, punish you for doing bad, reward you for doing good, then you can be virtuous. But since atheists don't know or don't believe there is a God, they can't be truly virtuous. They can feign to be virtuous, they can pretend to be virtuous, but without knowing that there's anyone to keep them account, they can't really be trusted. So in some sense, John Locke's equality applies particularly to monotheists and especially to Christians. And so there may be a two-tiered form of equality where people who don't believe in God can't be truly equal because they don't have the same virtue. They haven't realized the fruits of their rationality. Now let me introduce Shi. She's a Taiwanese Buddhist nun, and she's been very involved in activism, one of the most well-known activist Buddhist nuns in Taiwan. She's the co-founder of the Buddhist Hsinchu College and the co-founder of the Life Conservationist Association. The Life Conservationist Association is an organization that works on issues related to animals without a really clear line between human and non-human animals. Although much of their work is on non-human animals, some of their other projects like anti-gambling, anti-nuclear also relate to humans. But today I'm primarily interested in their advocacy work and lobbying for the concept of equality of life on behalf of non-human animals. And finally, Shi Jiahui currently is a professor of religion and culture at Xuanzhuang University. So, what does she have to say about equality? Well, she takes up this idea of inequality in Christian thinking in this quotation here. Compared to Christianity's theory that God, humans, and animals have different statuses, the Buddhist theory of equality among sentient beings provides a strong theoretical foundation for treating humans and animals with equal kindness. And so how does she justify this form of equality? She actually says that it has three levels. There's an equality of sentient beings, an equality of the nature of all dharmas, and the equality of Buddha nature. So first, the equality of sentient beings basically refers to all beings that are sentient, which means that they're aware, have feelings and thoughts, and in the course of this presentation and Jiahui's activism, that primarily means human and non-human animals. In a more classical Buddhist sense, it would also mean, and I think Shi Jiahui would also support that it also refers to other beings such as hell beings, hungry ghosts, asuras, and gods. But in terms of activism, these kind of non-earth-bound beings are not what we're really addressing here. And then second is the equality of the nature of all dharmas. Dharmas here basically means things, all things that exist in the world. And the nature of all dharmas is that all things arise from causes and conditions. So since things arise from causes and conditions, they're prone to change over time as causes and conditions to change, and they're linked to other things because they're linked through these causes and conditions. So in other words, nothing is permanent and nothing is independent. Since all things arise from causes and conditions, they all have the same nature and they're equal in that regard. Finally, the equality of Buddha nature. When we talk about sentient beings, they're all caught in the sea of samsara, or the process of rebirth, and eventually all beings can become Buddhas. Even if they have to be reborn in another life and work in that other life, they have the capacity to become a Buddha. And in that sense, all sentient beings are equal. Now, the primary method of my research is ethnographic. So I want to introduce one of my primary field sites. Actually, I would say that Taiwan, the entire island, is my field site, and I've traveled around the entire island doing different types of field research. But in this presentation, I'm going to particularly focus on a site called Tianpu, or Tsubahu Hamlet, in Jianshi Township, Hsinchu County, Taiwan. This hamlet is in the mountains at an elevation of around 1,100 meters. The population is around 145 households, with officially 446 residents on the weekends, especially because on the weekdays, many residents go down to the mainland to work and to study. And Tianpu is about a 10-hour trip to Taiwan. And until 1978, Taiwan was the closest market. There was no road built into the mountains at that time. And so the people in Tianpu and nearby villages, they needed to live a subsistence lifestyle based on farming, hunting, and gathering. And if they needed any other supplies, they had to walk 10 hours to Taiwan, which was pretty restrictive. Now, Tianpu is developed, has concrete homes, running water, electricity, this type of thing. Still a lot of farming and hunting, so it's changed a lot. But in the near past, subsistence was the primary driver for gathering, hunting, farming, and the local traditions. Now, Tianpu specializes in the cultivation of tomatoes, but it also grows cabbage, peaches, pears, persimmons, and other crops. Now, I said I would introduce Dayan Gaga. Dayan are the people that live in Tianpu. Their nation, one of, I believe, 16 recognized indigenous communities in Taiwan, and there's about 8 more that are working to get recognized. And there were more different communities historically, but many of the lowland indigenous communities were assimilated by Han people. And so the Dayan is one of the recognized nations of indigenous people. And until around 1930, one of the primary practices of Gaga was headhunting. Gaga, this word Gaga, in the Dayan language, means law. And around central to this form of law was the headhunting practice. Not only was headhunting a way for men to be recognized as men, all men needed to engage in a successful headhunting expedition to be able to get tattoos on their face and be recognized as men, and to be able to cross the Rainbow Bridge, which I'll talk about in a little bit. In 1895, the Japanese defeated the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, and it wasn't until the early 20th century that the Japanese went and colonized the indigenous communities in the mountains. Before that, even though the Qing dynasty claimed Taiwan as part of its territory, they never actually were successful in invading the mountains and conquering the indigenous people. So it was the first time when Japanese used modern techniques like carpet bombing to subdue indigenous people, that indigenous peoples finally fell under the control of an outside empire. And until around 1930, they practiced headhunting, which was also a way of determining who was right in a conflict. It was used in many different ways. There's rituals involved, and it was controlled by the ancestors who enforced the rules of Gaga. So the ancestors lived in the other hunting ground, which was across the Rainbow Bridge. But they also had power to influence what happened in this hunting ground. And they did that through different intermediaries like birds, but they were also able to come in the form of spirits over to this hunting ground. And so they would impose seasonal restrictions on hunting. There was a rule that there could be no hunting to excess. There was rewards for moral behavior, good behavior in your marriage, in the community, all led to hunting success. Poor behavior led to hunting failure. This was all enforced by the ancestors. So it was honorable to engage in headhunting, to engage in hunting. But once the Japanese took over, they tried to use headhunting practices against the indigenous people. There were, as I mentioned, many different nations, and each lived in separate bands. There was really no concept of nation because each lived in a separate band, and alliances were often made within a watershed, and there were many different watersheds. So when people practiced headhunting, there were often rivalries, and other hamlets or bands were considered enemies. So not all indigenous people got along with each other. In fact, many were enemies with each other. And the Japanese tried to leverage this dynamic by encouraging the indigenous people to headhunt their neighbors. Once the Japanese did this, what originally was an honorable practice became dishonorable because it was used in service of the Japanese people, Japanese conquerors. And so it disappeared very rapidly around 1930. And what replaced it was the hunting of non-human animals. Many of the previous rituals that were held in regard to headhunting were transformed into rituals for hunting of non-human animals. And as I mentioned, men needed to engage in one successful headhunting wishes or expedition to receive tattoos and to be able to cross the Rainbow Bridge. Women also could cross the Rainbow Bridge and receive tattoos if they were skilled weavers. And this was a very central idea in the idea of Gaga. But as I mentioned, there were different bands of Diane peoples. They didn't necessarily identify each other until the Japanese came along with anthropologists and defined different language groups and started calling them certain ethnicities. Before that, there was really no identity as a nation of Diane. And so the process of nation building is still going on to this day. But when you look at Gaga, because of the historical fragmentation, there's different versions of Gaga. And in my research, I found two versions that are significant to the questions that I'm asking. One was that only qualified humans, men who were successful in headhunting and women that were successful in weaving, could cross the rainbow to the other hunting ground. In the other version, all of the game, all of the animals that a hunter successfully hunted in his lifetime would follow with him to the other hunting ground, and the hunting would continue on the other side. In this sense, you can see that there's some spirit that both hunters and game have, that it's able to transfer to the other hunting ground. And more recently, Dayan groups are promoting their cultures. For many decades since the nationalists took over Taiwan following World War II, the speaking Chinese or Mandarin was enforced by the government, and many indigenous communities were losing their indigenous languages. Although many older people still speak their indigenous languages today, in the middle-aged group of indigenous now alive, many lost it. But now the government in Taiwan is supporting indigenous people to revive their languages, to educate their children about their languages and their cultures. And so Dayan groups are forming, such as the Taiwan Dayan Language and Culture Research and Development Association, and making educational materials about culture and language. One of these materials is called Rainbow's Judgment, which explains the cosmology of the indigenous of the Dayan people and the idea of Gaga. And the film I'm particularly interested in, it's based off of a children's book by Limu Yaqi, because in it, the great ancestor of the Dayan people named Buddha, he successfully hunts a wild boar and explains to a young boy that all animals are equal. All life is equal, and they should respect the boar. So this further and more very directly discusses the equality of life, or asserts the equality of life in Gaga. And perhaps it's intentional, because this film is made in a Dayan language version and a Mandarin Chinese language version, and the idea of equality of life is familiar to people in Taiwan, and so it may be engaging in this dialogue about equality of life. Now, in addition to Gaga, I think it's very important to understand Christianity and the influence it plays in indigenous communities in Taiwan. Particularly in Tianpu, nearly everyone is Christian. Maybe about 80% are Presbyterian and 20% Catholic, at least according to the estimates of one of my informants in the hamlet. After the 1930s, I think many indigenous communities had to rethink their identity, because they had been conquered for the first time by Japanese invaders. And then World War II was going on, and when it ended, the Nationalist Party took over Taiwan, and they did not really allow Han people to go into the mountains. They didn't want Taoists and Buddhists and Confucians in the mountain, Han people organizing and perhaps rebelling against the government. But the government wanted to maintain its alliance with the United States in particular, and Christianity was one way of doing it, as they knew that many Americans were Christians. So they allowed Christian missionaries to go into the mountains. And in the 1950s, many indigenous communities converted into Christianity. The missionaries offered food and medical supplies when the nationalist government couldn't provide them with many resources. And so many people converted. They built churches. But after a period of time, the missionaries left, and they were left to support the churches on their own. Without the support of the missionaries, they needed to contribute their own money and resources, and the churches started to fall apart, and the faith also started to fall apart. But in 1972, there was a series of female prophets that lived in Tiempu, and they started speaking in tongues, shaking, rolling on the ground, accusing people of their sins, making prophecies of the future. And these women triggered charismatic revival of Christianity and really naturalized and localized Christianity in Tiempu and the surrounding communities. And an important role that Christianity plays is it produces an identity. It's not only the Diane that became Christian, but maybe 70 or 80% of all the indigenous people in Taiwan. People that used to be enemies and used to headhunt. These communities could now form a uniform identity with each other, but in opposition to the Han majority, who tended to be Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian. So now I want to get into a little bit more of the interspecies interaction, and I want to start with what I call multi-species colonization in Jianshi Township. When I was in Tiempu and the nearby communities, I heard many reports of the release of dogs, monkeys, chimpanzees, poisonous snakes, various types of animals into the mountains. And this is part of what was originally a Buddhist ritual called the release of life, or fangsheng in Chinese. And what this ritual basically is that someone with compassion for non-human animals may see an animal oftentimes in a market that may be being sold for food, or it could be in any other type of captive situation about to be killed or hurt or injured, and the person saves the animal by buying it or in any type of way. Once they save it, they release it back into the environment. And oftentimes, as part of this ceremony, they will chant the sutras so that the animal can hear the sutras, be reborn in the Pure Land, where it will be guaranteed to become a Buddha in its next life. And so the indigenous people in this community were saying that Buddhists, particularly from the organization Siji, came into the mountains, but also other religious organizations, and released dogs, monkeys, chimpanzees, poisonous snakes. And particularly, I would hear that they went to the hamlet of Yulao, which is about a 10-minute drive from Tiempu. And the picture is here. It's kind of a tourist stop on the way to tourist attractions like Smongus further back. And so my assistant, my research assistant at the time, he was a Han person. He went to Tsuji High School, so he was very familiar with Tsuji, and he asked whether these Tsuji volunteers or Tsuji people who were releasing these animals were wearing their uniform. There's a very distinct blue and white uniform, and the local people were not certain. Many of them hadn't seen it themselves. They'd heard about it. And I looked into Tsuji's doctrine or advice on the area of release of life, and generally they don't promote this form of release of life because of the harm that it can cause to the ecosystem if invasive species are introduced. or to the animals if they're introduced into an ecosystem that they're not used to. I mean, with globalization, people may buy animals at a pet store and release them, animals that are from another place. So it's a major concern, both for the welfare of the animal and for the welfare of the ecosystem. We talked to the police at Yulau to ask if they've had any reports of this happening. The police, who are also indigenous people, Diane people in the community, said they've heard the rumors, and when they hear the rumors, they listen carefully, but they've never had any official reports of this happening. So it was hard to confirm the release of poisonous snakes in particular. But if you look into other instances that have been reported in Taiwan, there are cases of poisonous snakes being released into the wild. In particular, an organization called Chinese Life Conservationist Association, which is different than the organization I mentioned at the beginning, Life Conservationist Association, but founded by a different Buddhist leader named Tao. And he admits that he personally has released poisonous snakes, and he defends his renunciates for releasing cobras in 2009. His followers posted on social media that they released 70 kilograms of poisonous snakes in Yilan in 2012. And these practices are very unpopular among Han people as well as indigenous people, for the obvious reason that these poisonous snakes are a risk to human health. But for Tao, he says that once the cobras have heard the recitation of the sutras, they will not bite people. So it does occur, and it does occur among Buddhists. And there's a question of what is the law in relation to the release of life? Are people allowed to do this? And there's no specific provisions for release of life in the Wildlife Conservation Act. Religious organizations are in ongoing negotiations with the government because the government is concerned about the impact on the ecosystem of introducing invasive species in particular. Religious organizations want to continue to do it, but their practice is protected by the freedom of religion. So it's very difficult for the government to unilaterally enforce any sort of law because it would violate the guarantees in the Constitution for the freedom of religion. Article 10 of the Animal Protection Law prohibits any act that deviates from social norms. But again, this can be superseded by the protection on the freedom of religion. And the Article 16 of Wildlife Conservation Act protects disturbing, abusing, and other improper behavior towards protected species, but that's only certain protected native species. It doesn't apply to any species that are not native to Taiwan. So if anything, it may enforce non-native species to be introduced rather than releasing protected wildlife, although there's some unprotected wildlife in Taiwan too. So what does Shi Jiahui think about the release of life ceremony? And you may be surprised, as a Buddhist nun, she's a religious leader, but she says, for a long time, religion has been comparable to animal protection law's area outside of the sphere of civilization. Animal protection law in Taiwan has been comparable to the one country, two systems policy. Releasing birds and land animals and releasing aquatic animals is comparable to a giant heap of merchandise. Long ago, the Buddhist sentiment of sympathizing with all life was twisted and distorted by a utilitarian mindset. So these are very strong words, basically saying that she is against the protections of the freedom of religion because they violate what she sees as the rights of animals. So it's a very interesting statement from a religious leader to speak out against the freedom of religion um, because of the damage it does to non-human species. Now I'd like to talk about another multi-species issue where it's where animal protectionists, Buddhist-inspired animal protectionists, criticize the practices of indigenous people rather than the other way around. First, let me introduce the idea of Diane hunting. Most indigenous people, including the Diane in Taiwan, prefer 4 types of game: wild boar, the Reeves muntjac, which is a small deer, the Formosan serow, which is a type of mountain goat, and the Formosan sambar deer, which is a larger deer. I think momentarily there, my audio may have gone out, so I'm going to go back to, okay, talking about general wildlife here. Wild boar were the only species that were allowed to be hunted. Reeves muntjac, which is a small deer, the Formosan serow, a type of mountain goat, and the Formosan sambar deer, a larger type of deer, were all protected species. But in 2019, the Reeves muntjac was reclassified as general wildlife. But even general wildlife cannot always be hunted under Taiwanese law. So what is Taiwanese law in relation to hunting? First, early prohibitions on hunting were modeled on American law, and they had very little to do with protecting animals or species. And as such, many species populations were declining rapidly by 1972. And it became such a dire situation that the government enforced a moratorium on hunting in 1972 for 3 years. But as I mentioned before, the road into Tiempu wasn't built until 1978, and the people in that community and many other communities relied on hunting for subsistence. So a complete moratorium on hunting criminalized the traditions and subsistence practices of indigenous people. And at the same time, in 1972, a national park law was passed. And as national park laws were designated later, they converted what was indigenous land into national park land and banned hunting within the confines of the national park land, again, criminalizing indigenous traditional practices and subsistence. And then in 1989, the Wildlife Conservation Act was passed. This was basically due to international pressure, and it was modeled on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wildlife and Fauna. It adopted scientific naturalism and treated non-human animals as resources or commodities. It banned the hunting of protected species, and again, there were no exceptions for indigenous people. So once again, indigenous traditional practices, culture, and subsistence practices were criminalized. So since that law was passed, there have been a lot of changes. And in the late 80s and early 90s, as Taiwan democratized, a civil society formed, and Life Conservationist Association, Shi Jiahui's organization that I briefly mentioned at the beginning, was established in 1993 as the earliest lobbying group and activist organization on behalf of non-human animals. They quickly formed an alliance with other organizations called the Eco-Conservationist Alliance, or the ECA. They worked to ban trade in rhino horn and lobbied for US sanctions for assistance to bring about change. And LCA and ECA drafted an amendment to the wildlife conservation law in 1994. They basically rewrote the whole thing, but they retained the CITES structure, making changes with two goals in mind. Basically, to take out the profit motive from hunting and breeding animals. The first goal was to control the trade of wildlife and products made from wildlife, and the second goal was to prohibit domestic breeding of wild animals. For the first time, they made an exception for indigenous people to hunt, but only in traditional ceremonies, and the law still prohibited traps and snares, which were commonly used by indigenous people. While the animal protection movement was burgeoning and changing the law, there was also growing international support for the rights of indigenous people. And the indigenous people movement may have even started earlier in the 1980s than the animal protection movement. By 1991, Taiwan's indigenous people had recognition at the United Nations as an NGO, even while Taiwan's government didn't have. So indigenous people were a way for Taiwan to get representation in the United Nations. By 2007, the United Nations passed a declaration on the rights of indigenous people, which protected rights such as hunting. Before that, there were also conventions that protected hunting rights of indigenous people, primarily under frameworks of the International Labor Organization, but also under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was passed, I believe, in 1994. In Taiwan, in terms of legal achievements, there was a big change in 2005, but before that, in 2004, there was an amendment to the Wildlife Conservation Act, which facilitated the transfer of authority over indigenous peoples hunting from local government to the Council of Indigenous People. Then in 2005, the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law was passed. And basically, it had a very similar structure to the Declaration on the Human Rights of Indigenous People. It was passed 2 years before that was approved by the United Nations. In a lot of ways, because Taiwan wanted to show that they're part of the international community and obeying international norms, even if they didn't have representation in the United Nations. But Article 19 legalized hunting of wild animals, collecting wild plants, etc., as long as it was conducted for traditional culture, ritual, or self-consumption. Again, here, nothing that was for profit. The problem with this law was that it set up a conflict with the Wildlife Conservation Act, and that needed to be tested in the court. Judges generally favor the Wildlife Conservation Act in the court for various reasons, but at the same time, indigenous hunters are also prosecuted under the Controlling Guns, Ammunition, and Knives Act. And a major case that made it to the Supreme Court to test the constitutionality of these laws was the case of Tamatalum, a Bunan hunter, who was represented by the attorney Chen Sai. And Mr. Tamatalum, he shot a Reeves muntjac and Formosan serow in 2013. He was prosecuted under the Wildlife Conservation Act and the Controlling Guns, Ammunition, and Knives Act, and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison and fined 70,000 NTD, which is equivalent to $2,200 US dollars. Now, the facts of the case were not really disputed. He admitted that he was hunting, that he used a gun, but he said that he was following his local traditions, the Bunan hunting traditions, and that he was doing it for his ailing mother, who he wanted to provide fresh meat for. In 2017, his sentence was suspended while awaiting constitutional interpretation, and the Constitutional Court issued a mixed ruling on May 7, 2021, but they did not vacate his previous sentence and fine. They did say that there were some issues with the way that these laws were enforced, and so the regulations need to be changed. But they found nothing unconstitutional with the Wildlife Conservation Act or the Controlling Guns, Ammunition, and Knives Act, only that the regulations that support these acts need to be changed. However, the president, Tsai Ing-wen, announced a pardon for Tamatalum on May 20th, 2021. So the conflict between the Wildlife Conservation Act and the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law still remains. And so what does Zhao Hui have to think about the hunting situation in Taiwan? She says that just by returning to the basic act of humaneness, the anti-hunting campaigners could instead oppose blood sacrifice and meat eating. Then couldn't the pure and honest indigenous people become our comrades? However, in terms of campaign strategies, that would cause us to make enemies with a greater population than the indigenous people, meat-eating consumers, and the followers of popular religions, causing anti-blood sacrifice and anti-meat-eating campaigns to fail alongside the anti-hunting campaign. So basically, you see here that Zhao Hui recognizes that Han people also harm animals through blood sacrifice rituals and eating meat, but it would be much harder to conduct a campaign against such a large majority. 97% of the people in Taiwan. It's much easier to engage in a campaign against the indigenous people, who only compose about 2.5% of Taiwan's population. And she justifies this because it protects non-human animals. On the other hand, what do indigenous people think about hunting laws, as well as the release of poisonous snakes and the release of life? I interviewed two elders that were referred to me by another researcher who is Dayan himself, as elders in the community who are very familiar with, are expert on Gaga. And one of them is a Presbyterian pastor in Jianshi named Dali Behui. And he says that, and this is just some excerpts from a longer quote. I'll just read a few short sentences here. So according to the state's conservation, if a Chinese moccasin enters your house, you can't kill it. You can't kill a poisonous snake. If it's in your house, if it's in our house, we will definitely kill it. We protect people, we don't protect snakes. We protect animals, not those threatened and endangered species. So what does this mean? And how do we come to a point where the different sides can come to an agreement? I want to go back to where I started this presentation, human equality and the equality of life. First, let's look at how the hegemonic form of equality, human equality, works in this situation. Human equality underlies liberalism, and especially the logic of human rights. And both cases, when we talk about release of life ceremony, indigenous hunting, in the Taiwan case are determined largely by human rights. In the case of the release of life ceremony, religious freedom protects this practice. The human right to religious freedom protects the practice. In the case of indigenous hunting, indigenous rights protect this practice. So in either case, it's the interests of humans and the rights of humans that are considered. The interests of non-human animals are not considered directly. So Buddhists, animal protectionists, Diane, and indigenous people all must frame ecological arguments in terms of liberalism, the hegemonic system. On the other hand, if we use the concept of equality of life, then we have a different result, because the Buddha Dharma, and Dharma here I should note refers to law, and the direct translation of Dharma is law, just like Gaga means law. And according to Buddha law, equality of life is very important and characterized by a prohibition on killing. And recently, in some versions of Gaga, in particular public versions promoted by Diane culture groups, such as in the Rainbow Judgment, promote another form of equality of life, which is characterized by the practice of hunting. While there's still a conflict, the interests of non-humans are considered directly, and so ecological arguments can be discussed with the interests of non-humans in mind. And in conclusion, I say that to come to a compromise on these issues, both sides must not only comprehend the ontology of their opponent, they must also master the political maneuvers of the hegemonic system of liberalism. So equality of life itself struggles for recognition in a domain governed by human equality. Thank you for listening. And I guess I would just like to add one thing here, because there's been a recent development in the last few weeks. As part of my field work, I went to a protest in Taipei about several weeks ago, and the protest was organized by animal protection groups that are advocating for animals to be put into the Constitution. Not animal rights, but animals, their interests to be considered, if not equal to humans, but at least considered in some way or another at the constitutional level, which may help to resolve some questions of constitutionality related to animals. And if you look at what indigenous activists are saying about this, several legislators introduced different versions of wording for a constitutional amendment. And they presented some of this language to the Committee on Indigenous People, and they said there's no conflict with Indigenous people. So the council, the committee supported, or at least was neutral on animal protection. And activists who look at the case of Damatalum, at least one activist was saying that what the courts get wrong is that they're saying that the animal protection supersedes the protection of the law, of the protections of indigenous people. But she says that these are actually the same. What they don't understand is that they're the same. The protection of animals and the protection of indigenous culture is actually the same. So both sides are interested in protecting animals. They have different ways, and even they may talk about equality of life in different ways. But I think going forward, there may be ways for compromise. So I'll leave it here, and I'll be interested to hear more about your questions and comments as we open it up for discussion. Thank you.
好 ，Thank you, Jeff。那就谢谢刚刚这个非常，我觉得整理的非常的好，然后这个条理分明的一场演讲，然后涉及的这个脉络也非常的广哈，既广又深这样哈。那相信他在座的各位还有线上的朋友们哈，应该会有蛮多的问题会想要再进一步请教 Jeff。那我们现在就开放大家来提问。So we're opening up the platform.
线上的那个回应你们可以看到吗？
可以，我现在有进去那个 Zoom 里面，对。So we're opening up for Q&A, and so for those of you who are online， 在线上的朋友们，欢迎就是也可以打字哈，或者是可以就是举手发言这样，那我们应该是可以放出来，声音可以放出来的，或者是你打字的话。我也看得到，然后也欢迎在座的各位。For those of you who are in English and would like to ask questions in English, it's okay as well. You can either type them or you can raise your hands so that we can broadcast you, invite you to speak up. Raise your questions. Any questions? 大家有什么问题？需要时间消化一下。Okay, so there's a question. Okay, it's from Elise. Okay, hi. Would you like to ask your questions yourself? Raise a question yourself. Okay, please unmute yourself. I'm sorry, we cannot hear you, so you have to. Do we have to unmute her first? Okay, sorry. Hold on a second, please. We cannot hear you right now. Okay, yes.
Well,
So
let me write it then. Okay.
No. We can hear you now. So please ask your question.
I'll just write it down.
Okay, so you're writing it down, so I will read it out loud. Okay. So Buddhism definitely talks about equality of sentient beings. Okay. Yet also Buddhism has 6 realms of samsaric existence. Okay.
So this is all
So Alice continues with her question. So 3 good realms, heavenly, demigod, and human. And then there's also the 3 evil realms. Which are animals, ghosts, and demons. Okay. So Alice, would you like to just write down your question while we go to another question first before you finish your question? Is that okay?
Oh yeah, so basically that's
Okay, so I will just repeat Alice's question. Okay, so Buddhism definitely talks about equality of sentient beings. Yet also Buddhism has 6 realms of samsaric existence. So 3 good realms, heavenly, demigod, and human, and then 3 evil realms, animals, ghosts, and demons. So in this scheme, humans are higher, quote unquote, than animals. So in this sense, the question is how to reconcile all sentient beings are equal. So that's basically the question. 那我可能用中文给他们翻译一下，虽然我对这个佛法的直接的翻译可能不是很准确，但请 Jeff 帮我补充一下。就是有一位这个听众提到说，这个在佛法里面确实谈到众生平等，但是与此同时它是有6种的这个存在，就是这个天地人，然后也有动物跟鬼跟这个
恶
鬼跟地狱，是不是？所以呢，在这样的一个分成6等的这样的一个存在里面，人似乎还是被放在一个跟高于动物的这样的一个佛教的这个存有的位阶之上。所以呢，这样的一种位阶论到底怎么跟所谓的众生平等这样的一个佛法的一个说法能够有一个这个能够说得通呢？这事实上也是给我一直以来有这样的提问，所以是不是可以请 Jeff？Would you like to answer the question one by one, or you want to collectively answer it?
I'd like to answer this one first because it's complicated.
Okay, so please go ahead.
I'll answer first in English and then Chinese. So, Jianhui Fashi does have thinking on how this works. And if you look at Jeremy Waldron's work on John Locke, he uses a term called range property. And for John Locke, humans have a range property of rationality and virtue. And there's a lot of ways that humans are not equal. My abilities are different than Professor Tsai's abilities, and we have differences in all kinds of different ways. We have different bodies, we have different ways of thinking. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear. So what is important for the sense of equality is the range property, and then a recognition that there's differences in other areas. So Shi Jiaohui's range property or criteria for equality, I mentioned 3 levels. The equality of sentience, being sentient is one. The second one is dependent arising because of dependent arising, causes and conditions being interconnected. And third is the ability to become a Buddha. So even though there's differences in the levels of the 6 Buddhist paths, there's still the equality of sentience, there's the equality of the ability to become a Buddha, and there's the equality of all arising from causes and conditions. Now, there's obviously a hierarchical structure in the 6 realms. For Shi Jiaohui, when she talks about ethics, she says that we can have preferences despite the equality. There will come there. She thinks Buddhism is very practical. It's not like some ethical systems with very specific rules that cannot be broken. So you have to look at a pragmatic solution to a problem. If there's a conflict between the life of one living being and another, there are methods you can make a decision. And primarily for Shi Jiaohui, the question is, how close is that sentient being to Buddhahood? So a sage would be closer to Buddhahood, and so we should protect the sage over, say, a cockroach, which is at a lower level or has a greater distance from Buddhahood. Or the same would be true of a hell beast or a hungry ghost. On the other hand, there's the flip side of this, that those that are closer to Buddhahood are actually more ethical. A sage, like the Buddha, will sacrifice his body for a lion to eat that's hungry or something like that. So the sage will sacrifice, and we as humans have a greater ability to be ethical than, say, animals who don't understand ethics. So on the one hand, as we get closer to Buddhahood, we could have some priority in ethical judgment. On the other hand, when we're closer to Buddhahood, we have more responsibility to protect other sentient beings. 所以我现在讲一个中文的回答，就是这些六道有天、阿修罗、人、动物叫做畜生，还有那个恶鬼跟地狱。然后这些六道当然有阶层关系，但是我今天讲的平等，他们还是都有平等，就是那个第一个平等，众生平等。他们都有感知能力。第二个平等，佛性平等，他们都是因为缘起而生的。第三个平等就是法性平等。所有的众生有成佛的能力。所以在这个范围，那个 Jeremy Waldron 叫做这个特质 range property。你只有这个 range property， 你就是平等的，虽然其他方面是可能不平等，我们的能力是不一样，我们的身体是不一样。比方说，我今天讲的这些六道比较包含这个有活体的两道，动物、畜生跟人类。可是其他的这些道就没有活体。所以在那个方面，他们不是完全平等。可是虽然没有活体，他们还是生命有感知能力，还是有佛性，还是有法性，所以还是在这方面符合这个 range property。然后那个如果有一个情况要做一个决定，就是有冲突的情况，一个生命跟另外一个生命有冲突。那个教会法师认为佛教非常实际，所以没有非常固定的结论。你要做决定的时候，有一些阶层可以看，就是从成佛的距离。比方说，一个长老，离成佛的距离比一个圣人还远。所以，如果一个长老跟一个圣人有冲突，你可以决定保护那个圣人。可是反过来说，就是圣人的这个道德意识比较强，所以长老可能没有道德意识，他不用按照道德做行为，但是人类有道德，所以就是离生活比较近的生命比较要负责道德的行为。
Yeah. Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Sort of. Oh, thank you, though. Thanks for that.
Great to see you, Elise.
Nice to see you, Jeff. My friend.
OK, so 我们有一个现场的听众有问题，我把麦克风交给你，这样我们
刚才留言的是不是先提了？
留言的先
对，本来应该先。But you didn't answer Alex's question concerning levels of enlightenment, it seems that human beings are better enlightened, then they are better off, right? But how about dogs and cats? But not the portrait, but the other sentient beings. So and also the range of the priority of their being able to be saved, or that is also questionable. The sage can be saved.
Right. So
yeah. How about dogs and cats?
yeah. No. Well,
horses and cows.
Fundamentally, we should protect all beings. I mean, that's 互生的概念. I didn't say 互生 today, which is protecting life, but the concept of equality of life is part of protecting life. And so we should protect all life. When there's only some special cases where two lives come into conflict with each other. I mean, for example, we have to walk as humans, like we could accidentally step on an insect and we don't even know that we did it. So to live in the world, we have to have some practical ethics. And in the structure that Elise mentioned today, humans are at a higher level than 畜生, higher level than beasts or animals. So a human would, if a human life were to be in conflict with a non-human life. So if we're to take a very specific example, if a cobra or a Bible Chinese moccasin is in your house, there's a question of, is the snake's life more important than human life? And I think for Shi Jiaohui, you should try to protect the moccasin if possible, but if there's really no way to protect the moccasin, then you kill the moccasin to protect the human, because the human is closer to Buddhahood, so it has priority over the Chinese moccasin.
The presumption of being able to move closer to the Buddhahood, that is again another problem. But let me just suspend my question. You can move on to other questions.
Sure, I think that's in the Buddhist ontology. Your form is like the human. 好，然后这里有一个Jianshi 的问题哈，请问你要自己问吗？还是我帮你念出来？没有。OK， 好，请说。可以，只是它有一点忽大忽小。可以，请你再说一次。
它其实是一种目前是一种霸权的状态，它有办法去，就是它有办法去在这下面，它有办法调整就是成有论。但是我比较感兴趣的是，其实现在就是其实许多这个独立的国家，它都去大量的去思考原住民的成有论，但是它同时它也在重新改造这些原住民的成有论。举一个例子来说，就是其实除了刚刚虽然只有讲到，就是说刚刚它有几个，但其实有一些很多论文都在梳理说，其实即便是不同的家庭都会有不止一个的嘎嘎。然后那其实如果用台湾的就是最有名的例子，可能是说蔡英文政府跟原住民道歉，然后他用的这个泰雅族的那个例子是 display， 然后也就是泰雅族的和解。 但其实如果我们继续看太阳族，它其实有非常非常多就是道歉仪式，它不是只有那个，而且那个需要唱歌啊什么，然后就是要包括有一些人会批评说他要到道歉的地方去道歉，而不是在什么等等，就不管。但我的意思是说，这个例子就其实表示了很多，就是其实他都一直就是说自由主义其实一直在暴力的去修改原住民的所有论，即便是他用一个就是 reconciliation 的框架去包容它，所以我们在想的是可能是针对那个这样他会处理他presentation 最后的部分，这样谢谢。那我的问题结束。
好，谢谢。
谢谢。我觉得这个是很好的问题，就是在村有论的边界，还是需要一些协商，因为像今天我讲的就是有好几个村有论，然后我在前面写那个不可同约，然后那个不在那个 parentheses 里面，所以就是可不可以，就是这些可同约还是不可同约，是需要一个协商。但是我今天用的方法是要把这些村有论平等对待。所以现在我自己认为的问题是，我不是排斥这个自由主义，我觉得我们还可以用自由主义，但是它的权力比较大，所以如果你要用自由权利去处理这些原住民的问题，这些原住民的村有论变成一个文化，然后变成文化的时候，他们的文化被尊重。可是如果他们的这个Gaga跟自由主义有一些不同的地方，或者有冲突的地方，自由主义的权力比较大，所以要按照宪法。所以我们就是要对待原住民的时候，要处理这些问题的时候，有一个权力阶层的问题。但是还是要想一些办法，可以让原住民表现自己的法律体系。然后台湾还没有到那样的程度，这个要改宪。比方说我现在我讲的这个动入宪的运动，就是这个我应该强调，动物入宪不是放动物权利在宪法，动物权利会把这些动物视为跟人类一样平等。可是你处理就是如果你要裁定这样法律问，就是今天讲的这个王光禄案的问题的时候，如果动物在宪法里面，这些法律有宪法的权利，所以比方说自由主义的这个宗教自由，你不能解决这个问题，是因为这个宗教自由的权利比动物权利还大。虽然有法律，这些动物野生动物法或者动物保护法还没有宪法这个地位，可是如果你把动物放到宪法里面，你要解决一个放生的问题的时候，这个宗教自由跟动物的福利有一样的地位，所以那个结果可能不一样。然后如果这样讲，就是现在有一个国际趋势，包含纽西兰、印度、哥伦比亚、Ecuador、美国，开始用那个 rights of nature。然后 rights of nature 因为是讲 right 是一种自由主义，然后因为讲 nature 自然也是属于欧洲的思想。今天我也想就是提出一些疑义，在就是宗教是不是存在的方面。Gaga 是一个宗教还是一个法律体系？因为如果是法律体系跟宗教有不同的对待、不同的处理的方法，所以这个 rights of nature 现在的这个趋势会放那个 nature 的 rights 到宪法里面，然后这样那个对待会变成平等的。所以其实很多原住民就是可能这个推动是被原住民推动为主。所以虽然这个 rights of nature 是因为我们现在的法律体系已经是自由主义的体系为主，所以很难完全改成另外一个体系。可是如果我们可以想办法用自由主义的方法保护一些存有论，是比原文的自由主义还可以尊重原住民的那个问题们或者存在。
更自由的自由主义。
Yes. Maybe I can say that briefly in English too for the English listeners. So the question was about these different ontologies in Taiwan, the relationship, even the variations of ontologies between different bands of indigenous people, different nations of indigenous people, and how do we acknowledge the kind of boundaries of these ontologies and respect the ontologies of the indigenous. That's the way, I don't know if that's a good summary of the question, but that's the way I understood the question. So what I mentioned was that this is a boundary issue. There has to be some form of compromise. But at the beginning of my presentation today, I mentioned that part of my methodology is to treat ontologies equally, not to preliminarily give one a higher level of power. And that's the way our legal system is now, assuming that liberalism is the basis for rights, the basis for law. And so indigenous culture is protected as a culture, not as a legal system. So it doesn't have the same rights. But if we can put different ontologies into the Constitution, if we can put, like I described, animals into the Constitution, then if we're trying to decide something like animal release ceremony case, animals have equal status in the Constitution. So the liberal freedom of religion does not necessarily overcome the protection on animals. And so it gives a more equal treatment of different ontologies in this regard. And this is part of a worldwide movement called the Rights of Nature, which is trying to give rights to non-human things. I didn't say this in Chinese, but it can include mountains, rivers, all of nature, like in the Ecuador Constitution, or just pieces of nature like animals. And so there's different ways of doing this, which I won't go into now. But it raises the different ontologies. Even though it uses a liberal system, that's rights are part of liberalism, nature is part of liberalism. So even though it uses the liberal legal system, it takes pieces of ontologies and uses a compromise mode to raise these other ontologies to an equal level.
我刚才的问题被其他问题，然后会去
OK，
再去
OK。
好，那不知道现场或者是线上，还有没有其他的朋友想要提问？ So is there any other questions from the Zoom in the online community?
Maybe I can follow up what Alice mentioned and also. Yeah, we're talking about equality. Of course, we tend to think equality among human beings are more important. For example, face to face, we see citizens and non-citizens. Okay, the non-citizens were stateless people. They were now treated to the extreme. People can violate all human rights against. Okay, for example, migrant fishers or refugees or people in Ukraine or Myanmar and Palestine. So there are so many brutal, unequal events. Okay, that we still lack the law to restrain international law or domestic law and everything. But of course, what you brought up is very important. That is equality of all transient beings. But what troubled me just now is that the hierarchical or the preference of this being able to be enlightened, okay, or being able to become Buddha, or it's like being able to be select in the Christian term, right? So I think that goes against this alternative, okay? That is not this like human and animals or human and non-human or human and the nature, but all beings, living beings. So there should not be this, as I mentioned, this utilitarian selection or preference or choice between the better and the less. But the basic right to exist, right? That is not to. So how to protect it is the second step, but the priority. I mean the first step is to acknowledge that equality of all, not there's an enlightenment degree or and so on. So that is my question. If that is Shi Zhaohui's suggestion or position, then I think that she is promoting Buddhism in that sense. Okay, there's a teleological discourse, and also there's a utilitarian selection, and not the basic belief that there's a 所有佛法平等，所有缘起平等等等。
Well, I think it's a good question. It's a difficult question about how to, but we will inevitably encounter situations where the interests of one are put against the interests of another. And I think, I mean, in Jiahui Fashi's case, her interpretation of Buddhism, she has a Buddhist answer to this question. Indigenous people, according to their ontology, have a different answer to this question. I mean,
I think that relates to here, for example, when we talk about this sovereignty or this the realm of the subjecthood, okay, everyone has that realm of subjecthood or sovereignty which can extend and beyond limits. Right? So the question is how to restrain and not to how to choose. Or I think that is a very fundamental question.
well, I mean, I think, I mean, in terms of Shi Zhaohui, I think that she would agree with you that how to restrain is the first question. to avoid harming all life when it's possible. That's the basic concept of Hushan, the basic concept of protection. So always restraint first. The problem is that in this world that we can never only rely on restraint, because there's always cases where one life and another life have interests that are fundamentally in conflict. I mean, if we were to say that every bacteria has the same protection as a human life, then we can use antibiotics to save ourselves. So there has to be some way of differentiating and making decisions. And yes, there will be some hierarchy there. Now, I can understand that most people, a lot of people, non-Buddhists, I should say, may not accept Shijiahui's alternative to look at who's closest to enlightenment. But we still need some method. And how do we do that? I mean, Peter Singer has, you mentioned utilitarianism. He's the lead utilitarian philosopher.
Alice mentioned.
And Shijiahui is in conversation with Peter Singer. And they have disagreements, but they still are working together. And that's the idea. Is like, okay, Peter Singer is a naturalist. Jiahui is a Buddhist. They disagree on the details, but the general thrust of equality is the same. And for Peter Singer, he says that all things are equal because they have feelings. They can feel. But he's not an advocate of rights, animal rights, because animal rights make all things equal, like you kind of mentioned, like if you don't make a judgment, everything's equal, and if everything is equal, we have to protect a cockroach as much as a human. That's his problem with a strong equality. But for him, a softer equality is equality of interests. The interests of a cockroach are different than the interests of humans. Humans need family and relationships and education. A cockroach doesn't need all that. And so at some level, you have to make a decision. And I pretty much guarantee you that Peter Singer will choose a human over a cockroach. Jiahui will choose a human over a cockroach, but for different reasons. And the hope is to have these conversations so that we can come together in some areas where there's a conflict of interest. I mean, in the presentation today, a very specific one is the Chinese moccasin in your house versus human life. And in that case, I think that indigenous people and Buddhists can probably come together, even if they have different reasons for it. But that doesn't also take away the idea of equality. The basic idea that the snake has some ability to feel, has some sentience, for the Buddhist for Singer would agree with that. Jiahui would agree with that. Jiahui would take it further and say he can become a Buddha. Indigenous people may not accept that. But even if we can come to some equality, we don't have to treat everything exactly the same by recognizing what Jeremy Waldron calls arranged property. But there has to be some negotiation. I mean, when you have incommensurable systems, it's never going to be perfect.
Sure.
I don't know if that answers your question.
No, just some discussion.
Yeah.
There's no real solution, I think.
Yeah.
What we do is just deal with different cases and make our own decision.
最后还有，其实我们时间
到半，
已经到 OK， 那最后还有几分钟的时间，那就再邀请大家继续提问，或者是有一些 comment。我这里其实是关于那个狩猎的争议哦，就是尤其是大法官释宪案的时候，我们那个时候听了一些就是双方的不同的意见。那个时候我有一个印象比较深刻的一个说法是说，对于原住民来讲，就是今天在认真说能不能狩猎然后狩猎是不是一个原住民应该有一个文化上面的权利这件事情，如果我们把它放到对于所谓的动物的生命权的剥夺这件事来说，事实上相较于这个全球目前所盛行的主流的这个工业化畜牧来说，事实上是微不足道的。就是狩猎所剥夺的动物的生命权，跟工业化的畜牧，跟整个的这个食物的这个产业来说，对于动物生命权的剥夺，这不是只是在杀戮的那一刻，而是发生在从育种，然后到这个饲养的过程当中，还有最后的杀戮以及最后的处理，事实上都是对于生命权的一个非常极大的一种剥削跟剥夺。那所以关于这件事情，就是不知道 Jeff 的看法是什么？因为刚刚似乎在这个讨论里面，你在提到那个释昭慧法师的观点的时候，有稍微提到就是关于肉食的这个说法，但是我觉得似乎没有机会把它再更开展出来。不知道可不可以利用这个？如果大家没有其他的问题的话，想是不是可以利用这个时间也来听听你的看法？
我觉得这个是一个很好的问题，是一个很难的问题。我觉得就是像今天讲那个动物路线的运动，这些农民养畜牧的所谓的商业化的农场会反对或者怕，如果动物入线，他们就不能养畜牧了。但是动物保护团体的回答是，我们不是用权利的概念，所以蔡老师刚说的这个生命权，这个生命权，如果你说权变成比较像一个动物权利，然后如果是那种自由主义的权利，是比较绝对的。那自由主义的一个问题是有可能这个绝对性，因为人权本身都会有一些冲突。像如果你的宗教是杀别人，你的宗教意识是杀别人，很多宗教是这样子的，就是历史上现在比较少，现在的法律体系这样牺牲人的这个意识比较少，可是之前有。可是那个如果有一个人权宗教自由，你的自由绝对可以杀别人，可是如果别人有自己的权利，你不能杀他们，所以不能有那样的绝对性。所以这个权利的概念，我觉得很多像 Peter Singer 这些哲学家的批评就在这里，太绝对。所以这些动物保护团体将动物入宪的时候，他们不想把这个动物权利放到宪法， 其实有可能一些人、一些动物保护的人物，理想会放在身上，可是实际上会有太多的冲突，包含跟这些商业化的畜牧农场的冲突。所以我还没有去很仔细的研究这些立法院提出的条文，可是你要看这些条文是怎么写的，然后这些条文被实行的时候，还是需要这些法官的解释。所以我觉得教会法师讲那句话说这个反肉食影响到太多人，所以无法成功，还是在这个动物路线还是一样的。所以我觉得台湾的动物保护团体是比较实际，虽然他们会推动一些真的像那个 PETA， 有一个台湾 PETA， 或者大陆有 PETA， 然后我有认识过在台湾的一些 PETA 的代表，他们是推动权利，所以他们也会受到很多的批评。可是最后他们也是需要实际，因为他们知道你推动权利，你不能完全成功。可是反正动物路线是一个进步，然后那个原住民委员会他们同意动物路线不会跟原住民的权利有冲突。我觉得他们这样讲是因为按照他们自己的动物保护的理解，自己的存有论里面，动物福利跟人的福利没有冲突。可是如果是另外一种的动物福利变成动物权利，他们可能会反对。如果是一个生命权，你不能杀动物，你不能吃动物，这样子我可以保证原住民会反对。所以我不能自己给一个绝对的答案，我不觉得有一个绝对的答案。但是如果你放动物到宪法里面，反正你比较可以有一个平等的法律上的讨论，然后权利也是平等的。最后生命权，我觉得禁止所有的畜牧商业化畜牧农场不会成立。
但如果不用权利的概念，就是用福利，animal well-being。那你刚刚一直提到说，就是佛教团体用的是一个实际的做法，就是他会衡量他的这个运动上面的一些策略。但我在想说，如果真的是放在动物福利的角度出发，而不是只是想我这个运动成不成功，就是回到你讲，就是不只是人跟人之间的不同的这个衡量，还在于回归到动物的福利。如果从动物的角度来看的话，我在想的是说，如果今天他们推动的是在我们的工业化的畜牧体系当中以及食物的体系当中去做更多的改革，那它所能够造福的动物，我想应该会比去推动这个反对原住民狩猎这件事情所能够造福的这些动物，我觉得在实际上来说，实际的观点来说，应该也会较多。因为一个是极度主流的，然后是多数人不会去质疑，视为是理所当然的一种生活方式，而这个生活方式是奠基在大量的对于动物福利的牺牲之下，所被主流化的一种人类的生活方式。 但另外一方面，事实上是极为少数的原住民，而且是一种已经在消失当中的一种狩猎文化。那在狩猎文化里面，这个狩猎文化里面，它又遭到了重重的限制，它必须是自用为目的，然后它只能够用土制的猎枪，它还不能够用所谓的现代化的狩猎的工具。所以当然这边我们可能没有办法去讨论就是所谓的非法盗猎的人，但是说即便是合法的狩猎的这个范围，它所涉及的真正的以动物福利作为代价的这样的一种原住民狩猎文化来说，事实上是跟工业化的这个畜牧跟我们主流的饮食模式里面所牺牲的动物福利来说，实际上来讲，我觉得应该是不成比例的。当然我没有一个数字能够来讲这样的事情，但我觉得如果真的要从所谓的实际的角度来看，我似乎觉得这种动保团体，我认为他们也是搞错对象，这是我自己的看法。但是我不知道说有没有曾经你曾经遇到过，就是这个相关的讨论是从这个角度来参与这样的看这样的一个争论。
搞错对方。
搞错对象，我的意思是说，如果他们真的想要的是去增加动物的福利，然后减少这个animal suffering 的话，那我觉得事实上，你把原住民狩猎，台湾的原住民狩猎当成是一个争论的焦点，然后你放了非常多的这个运动的这个资源跟社会资源在这个讨论上，我觉得似乎没有真的能够帮助多少的动物去减少他们的 suffering。
对啊，我知道你对，我觉得其实这些动物保护团体，他们不是没有进行这个反肉食，他们还是在推动素食，但是他们不要用一个强烈的方式去推动这个，因为他们知道这样的法律不会通过。所以其实我觉得在狩猎方面反对狩猎，他们不是现在也是比较实际，他们不是完全反对狩猎，他们还是支持原住民的狩猎的权利。他们主要是对，就是像你讲的，就是用一个比较尊重动物福利的方法去让原住民去打猎。他们还没有到一个最后的一个能用的一个协商，但是对啊，就是我不知道我觉得是一个很难的问题，对。可是我主要的意思是，他们不是完全忽略这些农场，就是工业化的农场的问题。其实他们在推动，只是他们同时在推动很多的运动，然后能跟原住民合作推动的运动，他们也会合作推动。所以我还是觉得不是很绝对。可是当然，一些不是每个动物保护团体是一样的，他们之间没有冲突。
好，不好意思，那个时间上有点超过，因为最后的这个讨论。那我们今天的时间就到这边是就结束了。那非常谢谢这个Jeff， 就是给了我们一个非常 detail 然后非常仔细的一个 presentation， 然后在 Q&A 当中也非常仔细的回答了非常多很困难的这个问题，这样而且是尝试以这个bilingual的方式，中文英文就是尝试来尽量的满足这个不同需求的听众，这样，所以非常感谢他，然后也非常感谢就是线上的朋友们提出了非常棒的问题。好，那就非常谢谢大家今天的参与，那我们的这个今天的演讲就到这边，谢谢大家。
谢谢。
Right.
谢谢。
Thank you.
以后有机会再聊。